Aloha, welcome to the second episode of the 10th series of the Temple of Surf, the podcast. Today with us is legendary surf photographer Aaron Chang. We discuss with him about surf photography, his career, and much more. Hello, Mr. Chang. How are you? Welcome to the show. Where are you today?
Well, first of all, please call me Aaron.
Okay.
Mr. Chang sounds like my father still, who was a math teacher. And I'm in my home in Southern California, hunkered down because we're getting hit by a series of serious rainstorms. So that's where I am today.
Okay. So rainstorms, maybe then they bring like a very good waves to surf later on, right?
Yeah, we've had lots of really good surf in between the storms. It's been a very, very nice winter so far.
Okay. Well, we like that. Wherever there are waves, it's good to be. So for us surfer, right? So today we're gonna talk about many things. Of course, surf photography, definitely. But the first question I ask everyone on the show, in your opinion, what is the most important thing in surfing?
Well, that's a rich question because surfing is so many things. I think the most important thing in surfing for me is to recognize that there are forces and powers in the world bigger than me. And it really introduced me to the concept that God is out there and creating this incredible energy that we tap into when we're surfing. And I think that surfing is a really good avenue to explore your spirituality, and for me it led me all the way to God. So that's what I think is important about surfing.
Oh, wow. So can you tell me more about this journey to God? It's interesting.
Well, it was a long journey for me, but it began when I first went to Hawaii when I was 17. And I started to see what I considered perfect, beautiful, big, powerful waves. I would go surfing, I would paddle out or I would swim out with my camera, and I would get these chills down my spine. And I don't know, I couldn't really understand the significance of what those feelings meant to me at the time, but I think it was my first introduction to the bigger world or the bigger cosmos and God's presence trying to reach little me, and so it started in those first sessions. I was a teenager in Hawaii swimming around trying to figure things out, and every time I swam out I would get that same sort of crazy feeling, and it would go all the way down to my core. So it started that question in my mind, like there's something bigger here. What is this? And I think that question really helped propel not only my life in surfing, but my journey as a photographer and my journey as a believer. It really created the question of why and who and what are we here for? And all those things came together. And during my tenure on the North Shore, there was more than a dozen occasions where your life is in jeopardy and you don't know, is this that moment? And some of my best friends, Mark Fu and Todd Chesser, perished doing what we love. And you just kind of wonder, like, what is this all about? And what's the bigger picture here? And for me, that was the journey that I started on. And, it took me a long time to find Jesus. But, when I did, he was there with open arms and radically changed my life and my life perspective.
Yeah, it's very deep what you're saying. In effect, there is a little bit of everything in the ocean, right? There is
Everything.
Ancestral link, of course, because the ocean was there before all of us, right? So
right,
exactly. But it's also I believe maybe a level of forgiveness, at the same time, so much power and so forgiveness, like a lot of time there are like nearly that experience that can become forgiveness if you see that in the proper way, like some people will say, I got lucky, right? And maybe
Yeah.
is a different project, that God has for each one of us. So, yeah, it's very interesting what you're saying. I understand. For us Italian, we are very Catholic people.
That's okay. You'll get there eventually.
So it's whenever you talk about faith, yes, it's something like we resonate with. Yeah, definitely. And so tell me about those years in the North Shore, like what was the key learning of that period of time in your life for you? Personally, you already told me, okay, like your journey and professionally, of course.
Well, I left home at 17 and I wanted to be a surfer. And so I landed in Hawaii and, I was really kind of naive and green, didn't know anything, couldn't surf that well, couldn't shoot that well. It was just sort of the start of my journey. And honestly, I couldn't have found a better place to begin because one of the things that I struggled with growing up, I grew up in California, was my racial identity. I'm half Chinese and half Scottish, which makes me an odd man out no matter where I go,
Okay.
except Hawaii. So I land in Hawaii at 17, and I'll never forget, I went to Ala Moana and I went to a snack bar to buy a plate lunch. And there was a woman working behind the counter that looked at me and said, "What are you? What kind you?" And I'm like, "What do you mean? I'm me." And she said, "No, what kind?" And she just kept probing. I said, "Well, my father's Chinese from Hawaii and my mother's Scottish." She goes, "Oh, good kind." And it was like the first racial affirmation that I had as a young man. And it really, I think that I always look to that moment as really the start of my life and the beginning of my journey, because from there, everything built on top of that. I was very introverted. I was very shy as a young man, so much so that I had trouble speaking to people, looking them in the eye, really, really had an issue. And I started out just wandering around, but I had a very wise older cousin, Caroline, who looked at me and said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I want to be a surfer." He goes, "Well, that's great. You need a job. What can you do?" And so I said, "Well, I worked in a restaurant. I made surfboards." She goes, "I can't work with that. Let's get you something more substantial. What else?" I said, "Well, I did well in photography in high school because I'd done a yearbook class and the intro class, and I could take photos. I did a lot of the photos for our high school yearbook." And she said, "Well, I could work with that." And a couple days later, I had my first job out of high school shooting pictures of tourists going to luau's at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel in Waikiki.
Okay.
And I would show up for work. I'd work with a hula model, either a man or a woman, and I'd take pictures of tourists going to luau's, and the company would sell the photos to them in the lobbies the next morning.
Okay.
Well, I did that, and I got really good at it, and I was living the high life. I was living with my auntie, surfing in the day, working in Waikiki at night, and life was good. But then winter came. That was in the summer. Winter came, and I wanted to be on the North Shore, which is not anywhere close to the South Shore. And it may sound close, but it's actually an hour away, and it's like a whole different world, the North Shore. Especially in the early 70s, it was another world because it was out there, was country. And I wanted to be in the country. I wanted to be on the North Shore. So I used that model of photographing tourists and selling prints to them, but I bootstrapped myself into the job of chasing around surfers that were tourists.
Okay.
And I would photograph them. And again, you have to contextualize this in the 70s where there's no instant film, there's no Instagram, there's nothing. It's like to have a photo of yourself surfing in the 70s was relegated to only the surf stars, and that would only appear every 2 months in the surf magazine, and that was it.
Yeah.
So I figured out, especially with surfers from California, they would pay almost anything to have a print of themselves surfing, and it didn't have to be that good a photo. So I started chasing them around, and I had clients like Mike Purpose was one of my best clients. He would buy anything I got of him. And I had the audacity to charge $10 for an 8x10 print.
Wow.
It cost me like $1 to make. And, I thought it was killing it. Some months I'd make like $40. And, it was kind of amazing.
It was good money, no?
Yeah. In that time, when you're 18 and you're, living with 4 other surfers in a house, you only need a couple $100 to get by. And granted, there were months when the classic thing that I tell about the start of my surf photography career is that it got off to an incredibly slow start because as I was shooting surfing, I would go to the beach, look at the surf, it would be firing, and everybody like, go get your camera. I go, okay. I'd race home, I'd look at my camera, I'd look at my surfboard, I'd grab my surfboard and go back. And everybody like, oh, not again. Come on. So it actually took years for my career to get going because I was really a surfer first. And the reason that I think I was a good surf photographer was because of that. I really approached surf photography from a surfer's perspective, and that's what pushed me to do the water photography I did when I did it in the 70s, because to me, there was nothing more spectacular than looking at surfing in Hawaii from the water perspective. It was just, like I said, it was spiritually altering to be in the presence of that much beauty and that much power. And it was kind of interesting because the established superstar photographers, Steve Wilkins, Jeff Devine, Art Brewer, all had the business dialed, and Steve Wilkins was my hero at Pipeline. And I remember seeing a photograph of him when I was growing up in a magazine, sitting in an inner tube shooting Pipeline from the water, from the shoulder. I'm like, wow, someday I'm going to do that. And when I actually swam out there, I couldn't afford the long lenses they had. So I only had a short lens, and my simple solution was swim closer.
Nice.
So I started swimming into the waves to compensate for the lack of focal length. And I stumbled into a way of changing the way surfers looked at surfing from really an inside perspective where you're in a big, giant, beautiful wave. A wide angle lens is kind of more emulating the fisheye view of your eyes when you're surfing or paddling. And in my 3rd year of shooting water shots at Pipeline, I stumbled into a photo of Doug Brown at Pipeline that was just, incredibly beautiful and really kind of groundbreaking because I was in closer to the wave than anybody had ever been before. And I remember getting my little yellow box of slides back from the lab, coming on that slide and just going, oh my.
Oh.
And it was so groundbreaking for me that I had to get affirmation. I had to show it to somebody. And so I found Jeff Devine, who was, one of the legends that I grew up looking at. And I showed it to him and he goes, that's an amazing photo. That's the best surf photo I've ever seen in my life, and blah, blah, blah. So that was the photo that actually launched my career. But here's an interesting side story. I sent it to Surfer Magazine. and it was rejected.
No way. Okay.
Imagine that. I couldn't believe it, you know. I don't know what was going on. I don't know what happened, but I sent it to Surfing Magazine and they went crazy with it. They published it as a pull-out poster in the magazine. It got seen by a publisher in New York. It got printed as a life-size poster. And in an analog way, it went viral because that poster sold thousands of posters all over the world.
Wow.
And fast forward, 4 or 5 years when I started traveling as a senior photographer for Surfing Magazine, I would walk into a bar in Paris and there'd be my poster up. I'd go into a little shack in Brazil. There's my poster. It was crazy, but that was the shot that really kind of put me on the map. And from there, that was shot with a 50 millimeter. I started exploring wider and wider and wider lenses and ultimately ended up with a fisheye lens. And I remember trying that for the first time at Porto Escondido and shooting Matt Archibald in the tube and going over the falls on top of him and getting the most bizarre, distorted, peculiar photo ever. And thinking, there's something to this. And I think that started the whole fisheye look in surfing.
I mean,
so that was a big deal for me.
You push boundaries, right?
Always. Yeah, that was my, I think I really thrived on that. I thrived on the physicality of it because I was, like I said, I grew up as a surfer. I was a competitive swimmer. I played badminton. I did a lot of sporting things competitively, and I really loved the physicality of water photography. And and when you're in Hawaii on the North Shore, you're not only testing your own parameters, but you're testing convention, you're testing boundaries with a very serious consequence, which as a young man cannot be more exciting. Because every day you're like, okay, it's a little bigger. It's a little bigger. And I was, constantly training and trying to evolve my skills to become accepted in the Hawaiian community as a waterman. And that was, for many years, that was my goal, to be accepted in that elite community.
It worked, right?
I think I made it.
I did.
Yeah.
And well, the fact that you were swimming, that you were a swimmer, of course, it helped, right? Because as you said, when you have that huge water barrels that are falling on your head, even if you are there and taking the picture and you're not in the action of the surfboard, you need to have you need to be athletic, right?
Absolutely.
And
yeah, and it's athleticism again at an extreme level. I mean, I trained so constantly and so hard. And on top of that, every night after training, we'd go play tennis for an hour or two.
Okay.
Across from Pipeline at the public tennis courts. But I mean, to say that I was in peak physical shape was an understatement because, I remember getting tested, and you get tested when you least expect it. Like one time I swam out to Waimea Bay, and this was, again, before surf forecasting. At that time, nobody knew what the surf was going to do. You just, it's big. I'm going out. You didn't know if it was going to climb or get smaller. Well, this one day it kept climbing and climbing, and the bay started closing out, and I went to swim in, and I couldn't get in because there was so much backwash. And when that happens, you end up getting swept down the beach and you go past the jumping rock, and then you're back out in the open ocean. So you're swimming another mile on top of that mischance. And, I was in good shape, and I'm trained for this. So I'm coming back to the beach and I'm like, okay, I'm going to get up this time. I missed again. And I had to go back out. And that's when, all that training and conditioning comes into play, because now you're in a life and death situation. and you're a little head out in the ocean, and I'm pretty sure nobody knew I was there. And I'm swimming, and I'm thinking, this is what I'm trained for. I've got to make this. And the third time I made it in, and I kissed the beach when I hit the sand, and I was really grateful that I was in the shape I was, and I had prepared for it, because that easily could have gone wrong. One more time, and it would have been over for me, because I was also out of sunlight at the time.
Oh, okay. Well, so yeah, quite challenging, obviously from a physical perspective.
Very, very challenging situation.
And you were talking about, I don't know, Jeff Divine, all these like legendary photographers at that time. Looking back at those at that time, looking at those years, do you think that they realize your potential?
I think so.
Best photographer in the world, at the end.
It was interesting because Steve Wilkins was very, very kind to me in his way. He's not a flowery guy, but he was the photographer that I most admired because he had a formal education in photography. He was a graduate of the Art Center in Pasadena, which is, in my opinion, was at the time the best school in the world. And he had a photo studio in Waikiki, and he was doing a lot more than just surf photography. And he actually let me hang out in his studio with him, and he kind of gave me advice on how to get through school and what to do, and and laid the foundations in my mind about the business of photography, which is one of the key components to survival. So I don't know. Maybe, I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just the goodness of his heart, or if he saw anything, you'd have to ask him that.
Okay.
But, and that endorsement from Jeff Divine, those two guys were very instrumental to encouraging me when I was struggling and just starting. And I'm forever grateful to them for that. And I hope that, I can pay that forward in some ways to other photographers, because, photography is a very difficult way to make a living. It's probably one of the hardest things you could choose. And, to make it takes dedication, commitment on a life and death basis, in my mind, and perseverance. And there are peaks and valleys. Sometimes there's deep valleys and sometimes there's big peaks, but there's never a constant level playing field when you're doing photography.
Yeah. In effect, so many things in my mind. But if we continue in this avenue of surf photography or photography in general today, with the fact that obviously technology allow many people to have kind of professional, if not professional, tools that already was a entrance barrier at that time, right? Because not like everybody could buy. You said it yourself. I did not have the money for a bigger lens, so I had to go with 50 millimeter and then a fisheye. But now it's quite accessible, let's say, if we can say on that way. And then of course the film. They were like, again, more complicated, the development of the film today. It's digital. You can take, 100 shots and, law of the big numbers, at least one should be nice.
Yep.
So to make a living out of surf photography today, it's even harder than that time, right? I mean, almost impossible, isn't it?
Well, you can look at it a number of ways. I would say that it's not impossible. There are guys out there doing it. And almost on parity, today is the same as it was in the 70s. It really matters most what you have to say.
Okay.
If you have something to say, then the technology is just a means of communicating. It was the same when I was growing up. As I explained, I was a shy, introverted kid, but I saw these incredible things and I wanted to communicate to people the excitement of what I was seeing. And so I captured those in my photographs, and that's was my form of communication. The same way today, you know, the discussion is definitely risen to almost a ridiculously loud level because there's so many people shooting. But the people that really have something to say, their images rise above that pack.
Yeah.
And those are the guys that you pay attention to.
Okay.
So, sure, it's easier in some ways. The cameras today are, you couldn't have even dreamed of what we have today back when I was starting, and imagine my first camera in the water. I had one frame, and then I had to crank the film, and then one frame, and I had 36 frames, and I had to swim in. I'm about to get a camera that shoots 120 frames in 1 second. And everything's auto to the level of, even David Bowie couldn't have imagined that kind of advancements in technology. There was a great movie called A Man Who Fell to Earth by Nicholas Rowe, an Australian director, where Bowie's an alien. He lands on Earth and he starts deploying all these things he knows from his culture. And one of the things that he deployed to build an empire so he could get the money to make a spaceship to go home was film that you shot and pulled out, and it was already developed.
Wow.
I remember watching that, just going, oh my God, it was like the ultimate photography science fiction for me. And here we are now, where not only does it instantly develop, but it's instantly distributed globally.
Exactly.
So
crazy.
It's an incredible time. But to finish the answer on your question, I really think the most important thing in photography is to have something to say, to have mastered the craft well enough to say it in a beautiful and artistic way.
Okay.
And that will always have value.
Okay. No, I see your point. And in a kind of way, maybe you answer already to this question, but how much the perspective matters in a surf photography today?
100%. My perspective, my contribution to surfing was the wide angle water shot, the immersion, also photographing the lifestyle. I wanted to show, I was probably one of the biggest fans of surfing and surfers ever to walk the North Shore because, they were all rock stars to me. Like Jerry Lopez was a rock star. Jackie Dunn and Roy Russell, that was like the trifecta of surf stars, so I think that all those things combined really created a unique perspective that, and again, I said it came from inside the surfing mind, not outside looking in. And that perspective is always valid. I watched a great documentary on Clive Davis last night, and it took you inside his perspective into the music world and the hit making world. And, it talked about his unique ability to feature what his perspective told him would be a hit song. And so it's the perspective that determines whether the art is good or not. And being able to communicate it with a crafted skill is the importance of art, and the importance of discipline and learning and constantly experimenting with your art form, whether it's photography, sculpture, music, whatever, and delivering something to the world that has a fresh perspective, is rooted in history, and moves the cultural ball forward. And those are the things that are always going to be valuable.
No, definitely. It's nice to think about you as a young surfer, photographer, and swimmer, whatever. But at the young age, and looking at those gods of surfing in front of you, and it was like, I don't know, like being in front of Mick Jagger. I don't know, something like crazy.
Later in my career, I did a brief foray into rock and roll photography, and I got to meet actual rock stars.
Nice.
And I have to say that when I was a teenager and I went to the Seaview Inn to have a dinner there, and you looked around the room and you saw guys like Barry Kanayapuni and, Jackie Dunn and Jerry Lopez, that was 10 times more exciting for me personally.
Yes, of course, because that's what you like, right? And
Yeah.
you are surfer. So what was your first surfboard at that time? 17. Let's say when when you were at 17 and you were going between Waikiki and North Shore, what you were surfing?
Uh, well, I left California when I was a teenager with a board shaped by Dan Flecky, and it was a, a wing swallowtail single fin, about 7 feet long. I glassed it myself. I used to
Wow.
make surfboards, but I was going to Hawaii, so I needed a real shape, not one of mine. And that was the board that I arrived in. I quickly found out that it was not the correct board for Hawaii.
Okay.
So I started to befriend different shapers. And my first serious board that I got for the North Shore was an 8.2 for Sunset Beach, which was my dream wave. When I was really young growing up, I used to go to surf movies, and the guy that I resonated with was Barry Kanayapuni surfing Sunset. Still to this day, probably the best surfer ever out there. I mean, you could argue that Andy Irons was great, and Bobby Owens, and there were a lot of great surfers, but for me, Barry was it. So my first serious Hawaiian surfboard was an 8.2 shaped by a Santa Cruz shaper named Michelle Junot. And it was a very serious, pinny little mini swallowtail. And it was my first sort of not handmade surfboard. It was like from a real craftsman. And that was exciting beyond anything. And then, it started, as with all surfers, you end up owning hundreds of surfboards. But I'll never forget that first one that was just, and, I paddled out. I was so proud. And I remember seeing Barry out and, trying to kind of, as a little Grom, you got to imagine, like, here's a legend surf star, and there's me. I'm paddle up about 6 feet away, and I'm kind of sitting side by side with him. And, I'm thinking, all right, here we go.
Mm-hmm.
And a big set comes in, and oh my gosh, at Sunset Beach, you can get caught so easily. I'm paddling for my life through this giant wave coming in. And as I'm about to punch through the lip, I look to my right, and there's Barry inside of me. He puts one arm on his nose and he swings around and stands up with no strokes and takes off. And I'm like, that's a legend. That's a god of stuff.
Well, you had some serious people that could inspire. Let's not call it competition, right?
Yeah.
Somebody to look up to, and to inspire you and to get better. And wow! And what happened to that board?
I broke it. As every good board that I've ever owned for Sunset ended up broken. It's a brutal wave.
It's okay. It's a good end for a nice or a great surfboard, right? It's better that than it's just like in a junkyard or...
Yeah, it's like a soldier going down in battle as opposed to aging in a convalescent home.
Exactly, it stays over there.
Yeah.
And you before you were saying, that now in a certain way you have the responsibility to give back to photographers, for instance, the same opportunity in a certain way that has been given to you. Are you currently doing that? And if yes, how? And second part of the question, is there a photographer among all of them? I don't want to put you in trouble, of course, but a young photographer that you particularly like, and why? So very
well. Yeah, I hope you like this answer, but yes, I've done a lot of things with trying to help young photographers. For when Larry Moore passed away, I was very involved with Follow the Light, where we were awarding scholarships to aspiring surf photographers. Chris Burkhart was our first recipient of that award. And so I worked really hard behind the scenes for a number of years, helping young photographers that way. I've been approached so many times by photographers wanting advice, and my advice was brutal, but if they could deal with it, they might survive and have a chance. But and then I taught. The funnest moment was I taught a group of first grade kids how to take pictures. I've done so many strange things. One time, I was invited to teach photography on a special class to a high school in San Diego that services homeless kids.
Okay.
And so it was really rewarding because this was about 25 kids, all about 14, 15, that live on the outskirts of society. And so I taught them the basics of portraiture. And then I assigned them to pick somebody in their class and do a portrait of their classmate. And a lot of these kids have never been photographed before in their lives. A lot of them had really difficult issues even facing the camera. Eventually, all of them did. And the photographs were so amazing. In my gallery in Solana Beach, we did a show and a fundraiser for the school, and we sold the photos. We sold every single one of them and raised money for the school. So things like that in my life have been incredibly rewarding and satisfying. And you ask about a young aspiring photographer. This is, with all biases acknowledged, my son Saxon is pursuing a career in fine art photography.
Okay.
And I've been mentoring him now for he started when he's 14, so about 7 years. And he's really showing talent, and he's really responding to my guidance. And I have to tell you that he produces images that delight me to my core. So that's one of the most rewarding things I've done.
Definitely, because it's first of all, it's part of your blood. So
Exactly.
The genes are a good one for photography.
Yeah.
Definitely. And of course, it's he can have you as an example in every day of his life. So it's what every father would like to have of his son or of his daughter, right? We don't want them.
Right.
We want them.
It's a good thing for Saxon that he chose this, because there are very few things I could teach him well except this. So it kind of lines up with my narrow wheelhouse.
Okay. And he's doing surf photography, ocean photography, or he's doing other kind of
He's learning. His specialty is fine art ocean photography.
Ocean photography, okay.
And he has some images that are just, when you walk into my house, it's Saxon's image you see first. It's so mind-bogglingly beautiful. It's really something. So, but he's learning. I'm trying to teach him all the fundamentals. He's working on landscape photography now. I've been dragging around to shoots and kind of getting him to go in the water more and look at different angles and things. So I'm trying to give him a broad base with a focus on fine art ocean photography, which is what I specialize in now.
Yeah, definitely. And it's cool, the fact that as a photographer, we are able to specialize in something rather than to have like a broad, let's say, spectrum, or a broad portfolio. Yeah. At the end, I think once we specialize in something, we get better, and we can also be innovative, creative, more than just do everything, and of course, we have to pay the rent at the end of the month, right? So many of the photographers, they have to do other things to like wedding photography to pay the rent at the end of the month. But
I've done that. I've done everything you could ever imagine. Real estate photography, babies, weddings, guidebooks to Molokai. I mean, you name it, I've done it.
wow, wow. Well, and what to do? That's life. We have to deal with that, and at the end,
Yeah.
it's important to pay the rent. Okay, I have a question. I don't want that is gonna be a silly question, because usually, like what people ask to a photographer is that if he has a favorite picture that he took. I don't want to ask you that.
Thank you.
But you're welcome. But I am more in a meaningful one, in a meaningfulness of picture. Might be also some let's say crappy picture. I know you will never say that. You'll never admit, but can be even one that was not planned to be. But for you, thinking about the story behind the picture, that they had special meaning. So, do you have one or?
I have one that I talk about often in my galleries, and it ties very tightly to what we're talking about now. There are many, of course. It's like there are so many pivotal moments and key things. But this one image, I talked about training for years to become a waterman. And, that meant sacrificing swimming, to where I could swim all day long. And I kept looking for that day, which is my graduation day to become a waterman. And I remember in the mid 80s pulling up to Aokai Beach Park, knowing there was a big swell in the water and seeing all the best guys standing in the park looking at the surf. And I thought to myself, all right, this must be that day. So I didn't look at the surf. I just loaded my housing, got my swim fins, and I walked down to the beach, and Pipeline was third reefing, but the reef form was just unbelievable.
Yeah.
And so I walked down my rock piles, which wasn't far enough. I jumped in the water. I went past everybody at Aokai, and I still remember them catcalling and whistling and stuff as I got swept all the way past gas chambers to Rocky Point before I made it out. I swam back to Pipeline. I hung there for a while, like 20 minutes, and I got a shot of a reform hitting Pipeline that at the time was just jaw-dropping big and crazy powerful. I made it back in, and that shot ended up being one of the first images Surfing Magazine ever ran on the cover without a surfer in it.
Huh.
And I always look to that image and that day as the day I graduated and became a waterman in Hawaii.
Nice.
And I use that image on my business cards and in my marketing, and I tell the story often because that was really, as a young kid growing up and wanting to attain something, that was one of the hallmark goals of my life, was to be accepted in that very elite community of watermen in the world. And it was a tough nut to crack because those guys were serious, and they were like, I look at them like the test pilots in The Right Stuff. They're out there testing the envelope and flirting with death on a daily basis. And, that was my day of acceptance into that club.
What does it mean for you being a waterman?
I think it's somebody who dedicates their life to the ocean and spends enough time to not only become familiar with it, but in a way to become one with the ocean. In that, in those situations where things would go horribly wrong for anybody else, you can kind of navigate it and get through it and, live to go on to another day. I think that it takes a serious commitment in anything you do, whether you're a mountain climber, whether you're a F1 race car driver, a poet. It takes serious commitment and dedication to attain those high levels of achievement. And to me, a waterman is somebody who not only commits themselves, but dedicates their life to it and achieves a level of oneness with whatever they're pursuing, in this case, the ocean. And that's what a waterman means to me.
Makes sense. Okay. I have a I have a weird question that starts from another interview that I recently did with Jimmy Metico. I don't know if I pronounced his family name correct.
Close enough.
And he was telling me, about, one of the suggestions that he would say to young photographer was like, shoot everything, because you never know in future what will be like famous, what will be interesting or not, famous, relevant, and I was thinking about us that we are looking to your photos. We are fascinated by amazing waves, amazing ocean environment, surf, but have you ever turned the camera on the other side and focus on what was happening on the beach?
So tell me the question one more time. Summarize it for me.
Basically, it's like in your portfolio, in your things, so we know you because of the ocean, we know you because of the surf, right? But what was happening behind you, right? You had all these legends, most probably sitting down, a pipeline, sunset, whatever. So have you ever turn your camera on the other side and shoot what was happening on the shore, on the beach? Because I'm sure you were there, you must have some, if you have done that, you must have some incredible pictures.
Well, I think I do, and again, I said earlier that I was probably the biggest fan of the sport of surfing and surfers. And part of what I started to do was to learn to do formal portraiture. And I would do portraits of surfers, and to this day, I have portraits that I just love, like a young Rabbit Bartholomew and wearing the Australian flag like Muhammad Ali, and Titus Kinimaka and all his youthful glory, and those kind of things that I shot, but I did them in a different way, and it would have helped in this particular viewpoint to be an outsider looking in, because you'd be a lot more starstruck. For me, I was on the inside looking across.
Exactly. Yes.
And so for me to really want to take the photo, it had to be something meaningful, not to the world in general, but to the inner core of surfing. Yeah. And so a lot of those pictures were very personal pictures, and things that didn't have any relevance in the commercial magazine world back then. But there's a body of work that I think that maybe a book down the road or something sometime, just my portraits of surfers. Because I have to tell you, I love them. I love them with everything I could. All my photographic skill was constantly being challenged to make the best pictures of these guys that I could, to help them to rise to glory and to recognition. And those are the things that really mattered to me. Is I wanted to make great photos, not good photos, but great photos of these guys.
Definitely. Please, whenever you do the book, I click buy straight away now. Come on. It's an amazing book to have, but for a surf photographer today, a part of obviously the social media or gallery in your case, making a book is still a relevant thing, or is a kind of exercise or style where basically you satisfy yourself because you give life to your archive, but maybe a book nowadays is not loved like in the past? Is something that's still relevant for you or no?
Well, unfortunately, and this goes back a long ways, a book form of surf images is a commercial risk, a huge commercial risk. And as a consequence, the people taking the risk make all the money.
Mm.
So at the height of my career, I was hanging out with a very talented writer named Chris Carter, who went on to become famous through his TV show, The X-Files. And we were going to do an art book on surfing. And so we went to New York and we started talking to publishers. And we landed a deal with Little and Brown, which is the art book photographer and publishing company in the world. And our share was 5%, which we got to split.
Ah, oh,
So we walked away from that deal, and I have been approached by different publishers, but it just doesn't work financially. So, but I have to tell you that, you know, people that have figured out this process, and Chris Burkhart comes to mind. You know, I've bought quite a few of his books because I love photo books. I just don't know that I will ever be able to make one because of the financial model.
Yeah.
But, you know, that said, anything's possible.
Anything is possible. Yes. You know, at a certain point is a part of transmission, you know, of the new generations or to surf aficionados, lovers that they would buy the book, though it is true that talking with so many surf photographers, you know, already publishing a book is one thing. Then shipping the book, let's say outside US, is a very, very expensive thing. The cost of shipping, the cost like almost the price of the book itself. So it's
it just doesn't pencil out. You know, the thing that I work in now is fine art photography.
Okay.
And that business model, I've managed to figure out how to make it work. And again, you know, we've overcome a lot of significant odds, like you mentioned, shipping. You know, we've now at this point, being in the business now about 14 years, we create and ship art all over the world, you know, and we've mastered a lot of those logistics. And you know, it's something very satisfying to me because I'm still reaching people with the images. But rather than a book, which is, you know, 8 by 10 inches and 100 images, I'm reaching them with 60-inch prints that hang on their wall and are the centerpiece of their living room. So that to me has become very satisfying in a way of getting my work seen and out there. And, you know, becoming a gallery owner is a challenge because now you have to shift hemispheres in your brain and become a CEO and master all the logistics of employees and taxes and overhead and rent and, you know, all that stuff in order to do it. But if you dedicate yourself to that and you learn it, I think for me, being an artist and doing this has been probably one of the most significant and most satisfying periods of my career. And you know, when you take it to a philanthropic level, I'm in the business of enhancing people's lives by featuring the beauty of God's creation, the beauty of all the things around you that you may take for granted, freezing that in a moment and causing people to pay attention to it. Yeah. That's my job. I cannot tell you of a job that I get up every day for and I'm excited to do, regardless of the hours and the risks of being an entrepreneur. And it's been incredibly satisfying. Taking that to even a higher level, lately I've been working a lot in healthcare.
Okay.
I've figured out the psychology of making images that can actually enhance and improve the healing of patients in hospitals.
Yes.
And I have this very unique model where nature is one of the most healing things you can present to people. And of course, being in surfing, you're highly attuned to nature, and the elements and how to work with wind and tides and sun and everything. So, and interestingly, having spent almost 20 years traveling around the world for Surfing Magazine, I'm very trained at going to a location, assessing it, and capturing the beauty of the nature in that location. So for a hospital, what I do is go to the area the hospital is located in and dedicate myself to photographing the nature in and around the hospital and bringing those healing and calming elements into the hospital. And, we've been winning these commissions with big hospitals, and some of the most humbling things I've ever experienced in my life have been letters from patients that tell me that they use the art to pull themselves back from the brink.
Wow.
And repurpose their lives and heal themselves. It's just phenomenal.
Yeah.
And humbling and satisfying, and it's been one of the most rewarding things that I've done lately. Really, really enjoy that kind of work.
It's better than $1 million check,
Way better. Way better. I have letters that make me cry.
I saw that in your website, in effect, and I found it kind of interesting, because usually, we think about sounds of the nature. There are those kind of CD or Spotify now, whatever, with the sound of the waves, and or we have the sound healing, with the sound of Tibetan bowls, whatever. But obviously, sound is very important. But what we see, it's very, very extremely relevant as well. And if we think about, like, in hospital, there are all these white, gray walls,
Yep.
thick, and then suddenly you have like a beautiful, I don't know, sunset or a beautiful wave or a beautiful something that can inspire, and can bring you back to life. It's
right.
It's very, very relevant. I think I was surprised when I saw, but now, even after what you're saying and listening that people write to you letter, that really makes a perfect equation, right?
Yeah, it's amazing. I was commissioned to work on a new project for a senior emergency room at UCSD, which is one of the major hospitals in San Diego. And UCSD is right on La Jolla near Torrey Pines, right above Black's Beach. And so what we did was I spent 3 months in Torrey Pines photographing the park and the seascapes and the waves. And we brought all those images into the emergency room, and we printed them at large scales. Like we did, rather than a blank white hallway, we did these beautiful organic nature scenes that are 30 feet long.
Wow.
And each room had an entire wall covered with a scene from the park. So when you walk through this emergency room, you don't feel like you're in a hospital. You feel like you're walking through the park. At Torrey Pines. And looking west, you would see the ocean, and looking east, you'd see the mountains. And that emergency room is changing the way people perceive healthcare.
Yeah.
The head of the department told me that he has patients that tell me when they leave that they want to come back there for their vacation. I mean, that's the power of, this effort we're doing with healing imagery that is really significant. It's exciting. Super exciting.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely it is. Wow, fantastic. So I usually close the interview with 6 short questions, Q&A question. But before that, sorry, I have a nerdy question for you.
Okay.
But what to do? What you're using, Nick? Because I like concert photography. I do a lot of concert photography. And, in concert photography, there is always like, are you Nikon? Are you Canon? This is not an advertising, but okay, actually, no, I will not ask you that. I'm more interested in lenses. we talk about fisheye lenses, we talk about 50 millimeter, but today is still the same short lenses, or you have one lens that you like particularly?
Well, I have to admit, I have every single lens you could possibly want.
Yes.
I mean, it's really important as a professional to have the right tool at your disposal. So I have everything from a fisheye lens to a 600, and everything in between, in different combinations, different zooms, all the top glass that you can buy.
Can you imagine?
It's, you can't do this work otherwise.
Yeah.
And I constantly refresh my equipment on an annual basis to stay on the front of everything, so that I have the best that's the best.
Okay.
So that should answer. And I think if you're serious, you would do the same.
Definitely.
If you have extraordinary talent, you could use a 50 millimeter and make a great career. So who knows?
Of course, who knows? Who knows? Yeah, you're right. So a short Q&A session. Please answer the first thing that comes up to your mind. Okay. So the best surfboard that you ever rode.
My favorite board is a Twinser Fish made by Larry Mabel. It's a 511. It's been my go-to board in California for years and years and years.
Fantastic. Favorite surfer of all time?
That's impossible.
Is it agree?
I've had such a rich career. I got to hang out with Tom Curran and Tom Carroll and Mark Occhilupo and all these incredible talents. It would be hard to say. I would say that of all the great surfers, and there's so many, Kelly, you can't discount Kelly at all. But for me, I think my gut reaction would go back to Barry Kanayapuni and the way he surfs sunset. And, that's a manly surfer on a manly wave, riding it the way it's meant to be ridden.
Exactly. I was expecting that answer after you mentioned it 3 times in the interview. So I'm sure he has a special place in your heart. So cool. Definitely. Personal question: your favorite song or kind of music?
I like soundtrack music.
Okay.
I like Hans Zimmer as a composer. In the 80s, it was a guy named Vangelis. Really, really great. I like soundtrack music because when I listen to it, my mind visualizes the images that I would place there.
Okay.
I think that's the best answer I could do. I also want to plug a musician named Josh Garrels, whose music for me is special. He sings so well about spirituality, faith, and Jesus. His music is just mind-bending. It's so good.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing. Your favorite surf spot, if it's not a secret?
Well, I have to give a shout out to Martin Daly and the Indies Trader, because I got to go on a few trips with him in the Mentawais, and not only is he one of the most spectacular human beings I've ever met on planet Earth, but the waves that he turned me on to were some of the best surfing that I've ever done in my life. And we were discovering new waves together and surfing, and it was those waves there, and the variety and the change from one afternoon to the next morning was just spectacular.
Okay, interesting. Favorite shaper of all time, or favorite shaper today?
Well, I think that's a tough one because I'm good friends with quite a few of them. So it's a political landmine. But I'm pretty partial to Hawaiian shapers. So I would say that John Carper is one of my favorites. John Pizell, his shapes are beautiful, beautiful. And he graciously allows me to use one of his shapes for my photowrap surfboards in the gallery. So I look at his boards all the time. I think they're just gorgeous. You know, Eric Arakawa. Those guys come to the top of my head.
So those boards that are like covered with your photography, these are Faisal boards.
Yeah, they're one of his shapes, his step-up shape.
Nice.
And I just, a rounded pintail for me is a tough shape to get right. And to me, the board has to be absolutely flawless. His boards are flawless. They're just so beautiful. You never get tired of looking at them.
Good. He will be happy to know that. I'm sure he does. The last question is a little bit unusual. I ask to everyone on the show. I like to know your best relationship advice.
So I've been fortunate enough to be married 30 years to my wife, who is one of the most incredibly gracious, beautiful, intelligent, strong women that I could ever imagine. And my advice is to die to yourself. The more that you learn to lower yourself and elevate the other person, the better the relationship will get, the more growth there will be, and the better human you'll be as a result of it.
Yeah, totally agree with you. And if it is a 30 years love story and more love story, definitely you have a good advice to share with all of us.
Well, I fall in love with Erica every day. It's just incredible to me. I can't believe that, especially in the first years of our marriage, it was just terrible for her because I'd get a call from Surfing Magazine. I disappeared to Australia for 3 weeks and then come home, and she stuck it out for me. And it's just amazing to me. So I'm in awe of her.
Now it's your turn to stay home while maybe she travels.
Yeah.
Cool. Aaron, thank you so much for being on the show. And I look forward to talk to you very soon. Thank you.
Adios.
Bye-bye. Hi, it's me again. I hope you enjoyed our today's episode. If you want to know more about us, please follow www.thetempleofsurf.com and all our social media. Mahalo!